Moncton resident Marty Bourgeois works a low-wage job and struggles to make ends meet. It only added to his expenses when he developed type 2 diabetes about 2 years ago. Now, Parliament is wrapping up for the summer without the passage of a long-awaited national Pharmacare bill that would potentially cover those costs.
This is, for my prescription concerns and everything else, what I would need for the course of a day on average. 2 pills before every meal. Let's see. I was losing the ability to walk comfortably. I was power sweating. Every odd once in a while my heart palpitations were growing beyond understanding. But eventually I had a full collapse. I was given the death sentence that apparently it would basically cost me my foot within a few years. Okay. Thankfully that is not the case.
But the meds and related equipment that he needs to manage his diabetes still cost Marty an arm and a leg, even with the provincial government's prescription drug plan, which provides limited coverage to uninsured New Brunswickers.
Mm-hmm. So what kind of coverage do you have for medications right now?
At this time, strictly the New Brunswick drug plan.
Members of the program pay monthly premiums and co-payments based on their income from the previous year. Marty says he paid an initial fee of more than $200 just to enroll. Now he's on the hook for a monthly payment of about $88, which works out to more than $1,000 annually in premiums. And if you fall behind on those premiums, you lose coverage. It's already happened to Marty in the past. The provincial insurance plan partly covers the cost of his medication, but not equipment like needles. Altogether, he figures he's paying between $250 and $275 per month to manage his medical condition, never mind the costs of buying nutritious food, which is especially important for diabetics. And the costs are even higher if he's got a problem with his equipment.
Under worst case scenario, the machine eats shit, falls into the water, the needles, I get a bad batch, the cards don't register.
It's not a simple, straightforward process. It's not like just popping a pill, right? It's quite an operation. So it's a hardship on you? Is it a hardship on you to have to absorb this cost?
It's not convenient. I mean, it's not, especially now with the rising costs of groceries alone, let alone electricity, which was a cost for concern, my monthly rent climbing up an extra $50, which is now at $1,000 even.
Supporters of National Pharmacare say Bill C-64, the National Pharmacare Bill, is a first step towards universal single-payer coverage of all necessary medications and related products. It's a long-standing demand from the labor movement and public health care advocates. The legislation would start by making diabetes medication and birth control available to anyone with a health card. But the National Pharmacare Bill is currently stuck in the Senate. We have a new article on our website, nbmediacoop.org, that gets into the politics of pharmacare. One issue is that if the bill makes it through the Senate, the federal government will still need to forge bilateral agreements with the provinces and territories which manage the healthcare systems in those jurisdictions. Quebec and Alberta have already said they would opt out of this kind of system. BC has endorsed it. Here in New Brunswick, the Higgs government has been tight-lipped about whether it will join the national pharmacare system or not. A spokesperson for the Department of Health said on Thursday that New Brunswick is waiting for the federal government to initiate discussions with us about details of the bill. And there is an election coming up in New Brunswick in October where this issue could become a ballot box question. The NB Media Co-op reached out to the Green and Liberal parties for their comments on this issue. Both expressed support for national pharmacare. It's been part of the Green Party's platform since at least 2018, and Megan Minton, the party's health critic, called the current lack of universal coverage in Canada completely unacceptable. The provincial Liberal Party's health critic, Robert McKee, said that party is generally supportive of Bill C-64, although they want more details about its financial implications. You can check out the full article on nbmediacoop.org for the details, including comments from several New Brunswick senators about where they stand on Bill C-64. This legislation was also the topic of a panel discussion at the University of Ottawa on Thursday, part of a conference organized by the Canadian Health Coalition. And full disclosure, the coordinating editor of the NB Media Co-op is Tracy Glynn, who is National Director of Operations and Projects for the Canadian Health Coalition, which in turn advocates for universal pharmacare. Tracy submitted this video footage from the panel, which includes sections in French and English. It includes research by Nicholas Barry Shaw, a campaigner with the Council of Canadians, who has been researching how corporate lobbyists are, in his words, working to derail and delay a single payer system. Stay tuned. For the NB Media Co-op, I'm David Gordon-Koch.
Thank you, one and all. Thank you for taking your time out of your busy schedules to attend today, and to our presenters throughout the day. I've been listening and learning along with the rest of the participants. So on our panel today, the winning Pharmacare panel, we have, I'm going to forego the long introductions because they are in your program, so please feel free. We'll hear from Marc-André Gagnon. We'll present on health insurance at age 40, drug insurance in the making. And Marc-André is an associate professor at the School of Administration and Public Policy at Carleton here in Ottawa. To follow him, we'll have Nick Barry Shaw. Will present on how big pharma is poisoning the drug debate on Pharmacare, think tanks, experts, and conflicts of interest. And Nick Barry Shaw is the trade and privatization campaigner with the Council of Canadians. And lastly, we have the legend, Joel Lection.
The man, the myth.
The man, the myth, the legend. I should have said that. Who will present the quality and quantity of data used by Health Canada in improving new drugs. And Joel Lection, he graduated from the University of Toronto in 1977. He is a professor emeritus in the Faculty of Health at York University and worked as an emergency room physician for 34 years. So over to you, Marc-André.
So Joel graduated 7 years before the Canada Health Act. Wow. Bonjour à tous. C'est un plaisir pour moi. Merci, Pauline. Je vais vous parler de l'assurance médicaments et en particulier du projet de loi C-64. Faut comprendre, la loi sur la santé a 40 ans, mais la loi sur la santé n'inclut pas les médicaments prescrits. Et en fait, le Canada, on est le seul pays aux revenus qui a un système public universel d'assurance maladie, mais qui n'inclut pas les médicaments, comme si les médicaments n'étaient pas un soin de santé essentiel. Donc, depuis, malgré toutes les recommandations, même avec le rapport de la commission Hall dans les années 60, qui voulait inclure le médicament, on a un système, toujours aujourd'hui, où est-ce que l'accès aux médicaments est pensé en termes de privilèges offerts par les employeurs à leurs employés. Et si vous ne pouvez pas obtenir ce privilège-là, là, vous tombez dans les cracks et on crée un système public pour vous ramasser si vous fitez dans la différentes catégories. Au final, on se retrouve avec un système qui est complètement fragmenté, complètement morcelé. On a à peu près une centaine de régimes publics d'assurance médicaments au Canada. Donc, dans chaque province, on a des régimes fédéraux pour les vétérans, pour l'armée, les pénitenciers, les Autochtones. On a dans chaque province, selon l'âge, à l'île du Prince-Édouard, on a 26 régimes publics d'assurance médicaments. Parce que là, ça dépend beaucoup sur quelle maladie vous avez. Donc, on couvre par maladie. On a une espèce de loterie de la maladie, ce qui est assez amusant. Donc, une centaine de régimes publics, on a plus de 100 000 régimes privés d'assurance médicaments, avec des coûts administratifs qui peuvent être immenses. Donc, au niveau des résultats, si on regarde le Canada, bon, ce que j'aime montrer sur la situation, si on regarde le coût per capita en médicaments, Bien évidemment, on a les États-Unis qui est notre exemple de gaspillage et d'inefficacité. En deuxième, on a l'Allemagne. C'est juste que l'Allemagne a un 19% de taxe sur la valeur ajoutée qui est inclus dans le coût. Donc, il faut enlever 19% sur la ligne allemande, ce qui l'amène à égalité avec le reste du Canada. Mais il y a le Québec, évidemment, qui est donc le deuxième endroit le plus cher au monde en termes de coût per capita. Si on regarde, OK, on paie beaucoup plus cher qu'ailleurs, d'accord, mais peut-être que grâce à notre régime privé, on a tellement un meilleur accès. On peut mesurer l'accès par ce qu'on appelle le Cost-Related Non-Adherence, la non-adhésion pour des raisons financières. Et là, bon, j'ai pris les chiffres de 2016 et de 2020 là, parce que ça a beaucoup évolué. Mais le Canada, en général, on est après les États-Unis, normalement, on est deuxième en termes du pire endroit au niveau de l'accès. Donc, non seulement on paye parmi les plus chers au monde, mais aussi on a un gros problème d'accès. Sur la mise en place du projet de loi C-64, entre autres, sur les prédictions du directeur parlementaire du budget, il y avait cette idée que si on met en place un régime public universel, on va augmenter de 13% les prescriptions, donc l'accès aux gens qui en ont besoin, et on va tout de même sauver jusqu'à 2 milliards, 2,5, donc grosso modo, un petit peu moins autour de 8% par année qu'on pourrait sauver à ce moment-là. Donc, non seulement des économies importantes, mais en offrant un meilleur accès. Là, juste pour parler de C-64. Bon, faut se rappeler, 2016 à 2018, pendant 2 ans, le comité de la Chambre des communes en santé a fait des audiences sur l'assurance médicaments. Il est arrivé avec un rapport demandant un régime public universel. On a mis en place le conseil consultatif pour la mise en place d'un régime national d'assurance médicaments avec en tête Eric Hoskins, qui est arrivé avec son rapport en 2019. Et qui était en fait super intéressant. Il est ici, une ordonnance pour le Canada. Grosso modo, ce qu'il faut, c'est un formulaire national qui nous permet de mieux négocier les prix. Il faut un système pour tout le monde, donc une liste gérée. On va commencer par une liste qui va inclure seulement les médicaments essentiels. Et tranquillement, on va négocier les médicaments un peu plus complexes pour arriver au bout de 5 ans à une couverture compréhensive. Et à ce moment-là, on s'enlignait vers quelque chose. Je trouvais que c'était un peu lent, mais c'est très prudent, juste pour montrer aussi, on va mettre les choses en place. On commence par ce qui est le plus facile, le panier de médicaments essentiels qui couvre à peu près 70% des besoins en santé. Et ensuite, les autres médicaments plus compliqués, on les met par la suite. Le gouvernement libéral s'était engagé à suivre l'ensemble des recommandations. Moi, j'ai ouvert une bouteille de bière barriquée extraordinaire pour célébrer tout ça. Et évidemment, COVID est arrivé. Toute politique qui allait à l'encontre des intérêts pharmaceutiques a été complètement mise de côté durant la pandémie. Et là, on a vu finalement la réorganisation contre le rapport Hoskins et avec les assureurs privés, les compagnies pharmaceutiques en particulier. Grosso modo, ce que demandent les assureurs privés est assez fascinant. Ils disent, en fait, nous, ce qu'on suggère, c'est qu'on fasse comme au Québec. C'est-à-dire qu'on rende l'assurance privée obligatoire. Bon, une autre demande, c'était si vous obtenez des rabais confidentiels, il faudrait les partager avec les régimes privés. Mais ceci dit, c'est un peu bizarre parce que les régimes privés ont encore cette culture, on accepte de rembourser n'importe quoi, peu importe le prix. On ne peut pas négocier quoi que ce soit si vous acceptez de payer n'importe quoi, peu importe le prix. Donc, partagez les rabais que vous obtenez, mais on veut se garder le droit de rembourser n'importe quoi à n'importe quel prix. Ça ne fonctionne pas. Mais là, il y a un problème, c'est qu'on a tous ces médicaments qui coûtent extrêmement cher. C'est-à-dire, si vous avez une firme sans personne, sans employés, et un des employés, sa fille, doit avoir ce médicament pour une maladie rare qui coûte 500 000 $ par année, bien là, tout à coup, vous venez d'augmenter les primes annuelles de chaque employé de 5 000 $ par année. Donc, ça ne va pas, là. Donc, là, l'idée, c'est on veut des régimes privés, des régimes d'assurance médicaments privés obligatoires, mais quand il y a des risques, bien, les risques, on va les domper sur le régime public. On veut que le gouvernement prenne en charge une couverture publique pour les médicaments onéreux. Donc, on veut un régime d'assurance obligatoire, mais qui n'assure pas les risques, ce qui est assez fascinant quand on y pense, là. Donc, ce qu'on demande, c'est de passer du système, comme le reste du Canada, un système à la québécoise. On se rappellera que ça signifie payer 5 milliards de plus par année. Donc, on voudrait payer plus cher pour créer un système inefficace qui rendrait les régimes privés obligatoires, qui minerait notre capacité à négocier de plus bas prix, tout en réclamant au fonds public de payer pour couvrir les risques des régimes privés. Donc, c'est dans ce contexte-là que le débat sur C64 s'est fait. On se rappelle l'entente avec le NPD qui a forcé la mise en place d'un projet de loi. Bon, la date limite était le 1er mars. Donc, le 28 février, on a déposé le projet de loi C64. Il y a des choses intéressantes. Bon, on va couvrir pour le diabète, pour les contraceptifs. Et il n'y aura aucun copaiement, contrairement à ce que demandait le rapport Hoskins, ce qui est en fait une très bonne chose. Diabète, il faut se rappeler, il y avait des études fascinantes dans les 2012. On avait montré qu'en Ontario, ben, jusqu'à 64 ans, on n'est pas couvert par le régime public et lorsqu'on tombe à 65 ans, on tombe automatiquement couvert par le régime public pour les aînés avec de très faibles copaiements. Et on regardait au niveau de l'accès pour les médicaments pour le diabète et au niveau de ce que ça signifie à la fois pour morbidité et mortalité. Et on estimait qu'en 5 ans, on aurait pu sauver 3500 vies si on avait eu un régime public universel sans copaiement pour les patients. Ça signifie 700 personnes par année. Ça signifie 747 qui s'effondreraient au centre-ville de Ottawa. Évidemment, si c'est des 747 qui s'effondrent, on serait tous en mode panique. Mais là, c'est des statistiques de gens qui sont malades et qui meurent dans le fond des hôpitaux. C'est pas grave. On ne fait rien par rapport à ça, ce qui est fascinant. Donc, diabète, très bon coup de viser en particulier ce domaine-là. Les contraceptifs aussi, ça fait tout un élément important sur la santé maternelle. Le problème avec les... Ben, en fait, donc, contraceptif qui est aussi très mal couvert. Beaucoup de gens, en fait, les régimes privés, parfois ne couvrent pas non plus les contraceptifs. Donc là, on fait un statement de l'importance d'avoir accès à ça. Là, le problème va être le suivant. Moi, au début, c'est 64, tu lis le projet de loi, extraordinaire. C'est le projet de loi qu'on voulait. Il y a des choses qui sont un peu vagues, mais bon, ils ont écrit ça vite, c'est normal. Et là, pataplan, il y a eu
I'm watching my time.
le budget Freeland de mars dernier, qui, pour comprendre, le contraceptif et diabète, ça signifie 3 milliards de dépenses par année. Le budget Freeland annonce 1,5 milliard sur 3 ans, donc 1,5 milliard par année. On n'est pas là, là. Donc, c'est quoi cette affaire? Là, on s'est dit, bon, ben, peut-être qu'ils veulent mettre cette année, ils ont mis ça dans le budget, mais vraiment, le programme va se mettre en place l'année prochaine, ils vont changer le budget l'année prochaine, ils vont aller chercher d'autres crédits. Ça pouvait s'expliquer. Bon. Directeur parlementaire du budget, 15 mai dernier, fait, OK, combien ça va coûter? Et ils arrivent, parfait. Ils arrivent exactement avec le même montant. Ça va coûter 1,5 milliard sur 3 ans. C'est comme, non. Ce n'est pas un régime public universel là, dont on parle. Ça, c'est le coût pour ce qu'on appelle du fill the gap. C'est pour boucher les trous. On n'est pas en train de mettre en place les structures nécessaires, le premier pas vers un régime public universel. On est en train de juste consolider le système actuel de fill the gap. Et là, on entend Marc Hollande, même si le projet de loi C64, tout est par rapport à un régime public universel, Il dit, non, non, il n'est pas question de remplacer ce que paient déjà les régimes privés. On va simplement compléter ce que ne payent pas les régimes privés. C'est pas ça que le projet de loi dit. Mais là, tu regardes les détails. OK, Pharmacare est défini comme assurance médicaments et non pas comme assurance médicaments publique, ce qui est bizarre. Universalité est définie comme étant tout le monde. L'universalité en politique sociale, c'est un programme public qui s'applique à tout le monde de la même façon. Là, on définit universalité, tout le monde. Donc, à partir de là, si on a un système à la québécoise, ou est-ce qu'avec des régimes privés obligatoires, par exemple, ben, ça devient à la fois du Pharmacare universel. Non, ce n'est pas du Pharmacare universel, mais on joue avec les mots. Et cette ambiguïté-là fait en sorte que finalement, on ne sait même pas ce que le gouvernement veut faire avec ce projet de loi-là. Marc Hollande dit, on va devoir négocier avec chacune des provinces, d'accord, mais négocier quoi? Pas nécessairement un régime public universel. Avec l'île du Prince-Édouard, ce qu'ils ont fait, c'est OK, on va aider les gens à payer leur copaiement, leur franchise, qui réduisait l'accès à l'île du Prince-Édouard, mais on va juste payer le manque à gagner sur les 26 programmes actuels. On maintient la loterie de la maladie, c'est-à-dire que si vous tombez sur la mauvaise maladie qui n'est pas couverte, tant pis pour vous, il n'y aura pas plus d'aide du fédéral à ce moment-là. J'ai presque fini, Pauline. Donc, ce qu'il faut regarder pour moi dans ce qui s'en vient, ça va être évidemment les négociations avec les provinces. Qu'est-ce qui va être négocié exactement? Et si on s'en tient à ce que disait le directeur parlementaire du budget, c'est-à-dire les hypothèses qu'on lui a données pour faire sur son analyse de coûts, ben oui, on veut un fill the gap approach, c'est-à-dire compléter les dépenses actuelles. Mais là, il y a le problème, c'est que si tu dis, nous couvrons les médicaments contre le diabète et les contraceptifs, le régime privé, il n'est pas con, là. Il va dire, ben nous, on va continuer à couvrir tout le reste, mais on va arrêter de couvrir ça. Pour avoir le fill the gap approach, il faut une façon de rendre la couverture privée obligatoire. Il faut empêcher le régime privé d'arrêter de couvrir le diabète et les contraceptifs. Et ça va être important, c'est-à-dire de quelle façon on voudrait que ce soit mis en place. Est-ce que c'est légal de faire ça? Est-ce qu'ils ont la possibilité? Ensuite, la question, c'est, à la base, si on se retrouve avec un fill de gap, ça va à l'encontre du projet de loi C64 qui a été voté, qui est au Sénat en ce moment. Est-ce qu'il peut y avoir des recours légaux pour dire, ben cet accord-là que vous avez avec telle province ne correspond pas à l'esprit de la loi C64? Donc, j'aimerais pouvoir mieux clarifier les choses quant à ce projet de loi, mais ce n'est pas possible parce qu'on est dans l'ambiguïté totale. Et en ce moment, je dois dire, je suis très mal à l'aise sur la façon dont on fait de la politique à Ottawa, où est-ce qu'on propose un projet de loi et on peut lui faire faire exactement le contraire de ce qu'il nous dit de faire. Donc, je vais arrêter ici.
Merci. And for those of you who are watching, like the interpretation, there was a couple of giggles. So when you said Hoskins report, it just kept saying skins.
OK.
Skins report, the skin report. So just in case. Other than that, it was pretty good. I don't know about the rest of you. I was impressed with this AI type of interpretation. Go ahead, Nick Barry Shaw, please, from Council of Canadians.
Thank you. So yeah, around the time when Bill C-64 was being introduced at the end of February, if you were following the Pharmacare file, like I was pretty closely at the time, you would have seen kind of headline after headline screaming about how this new Pharmacare bill, single payer Pharmacare, is going to be a bomb that's going to detonate your coverage. that it's going to result in higher costs for the government and worse coverage for people who have private plans. And, you know, on and on and on. And the conclusion, and then there were other kind of more sophisticated voices that would be making the case for what Marc-André was just talking about, this kind of fill the gaps model as a more reasonable and better approach, and urging the government to kind of see the light of reason in its approach to pharmacare. If you looked at who wrote news stories, they would be identified as, you know, independent scholars, as senior fellows, as affiliated researchers to institutes and think tanks, and presented as, you know, credible academic voices, presumably. And I think what we have done in a recent report called A Prescription for Profit, and I did hand out little sheets with that kind of summarize the results, so I'll try to avoid getting into too many of the details. But what we did was we looked into who these institutes are, where their funding comes from, and who the experts are, and what their ties are. And what we found was that, you know, basically in almost every case, when you came across one of these op-eds warning of the dangers of public pharmacare, there would be a real thicket of conflicts of interests and funding ties and professional and institutional ties between the two industries that stand to lose the most from Canada moving towards a public single-payer pharmacare model, that is to say, in the insurance industry and big pharma, and these researchers and their institutes. And so that was the research. Yeah, we have it. I think we have it there, the Prescription for Profit. It's on the website of the Council of Canadians. And so I think, yeah, I don't want to get into all the details, but I do want to talk a bit about sort of the origins of this kind of nexus of researchers and institutes, and how they kind of link to big pharma and the insurance industries. And I also want to talk a bit about you know, the impacts that this has, I think, on public opinion, but also on the policymaking process, and how their work has been received, and how these conflicts of interest have been dealt with or not by the media. So I think one of the things we've used to kind of refer to what these researchers and think tanks are doing is an echo chamber, right? They're creating an echo chamber of industry-friendly messages to try to sway or confuse or basically slow down the progress towards a public pharmacare system. And this term comes from a memo that was written by actually a tobacco industry lobbyist called John Scruggs. And he was describing an advocacy technique that the industry should adopt in order to kind of push back against the scientific consensus in favor of restricting and regulating cigarettes and their distribution. And he was saying, you know, we're not going to convince the policymakers just by lobbying them. It's not enough to do that. We need to hit them with messages that are coming from many different sources, that are credible, and that are going to influence the policymakers, and they're going to see this kind of the same message coming from different sources. And he called this the echo chamber approach to corporate advocacy. And pretty shortly thereafter, he wrote that memo in '98. In 2003, the New York Times broke a story based on documents that they obtained, internal documents from PhRMA, the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers of America, which is the kind of peak pharmaceutical industry lobbying group in the US. And these documents described how the industry was going to be adopting a similar approach. They said they wanted to create an intellectual echo chamber by funding economists and institutes in order to get as many sympathetic messages as possible into the media and in front of policymakers at that time. And so they were focused on the US, obviously, but they had budgeted, according to the documents that the New York Times obtained, $1.5 million to fund institutes and economists here in Canada as well. We don't know who they funded. That wasn't said in the New York Times report, and I don't think it was identified in the documents, but in the years immediately following that report in 2003, 4, and 5, you can find many, many reports from the Fraser Institute, from the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies, these two free market think tanks, that did a tremendous amount of work on cross-border importation of drugs from Canada to the United States, which was a huge concern that was mentioned in the internal documents of pharma at the time. And that mentioned that they were being funded by a number of research-based pharmaceutical companies to do this work. So it's pretty clear that these kind of funding relationships have existed for a very long time between a kind of a clutch of institutes, and I would add to the Fraser Institute. Ames was folded into the Fraser Institute in 2018 or 19. But along with them, there's also the Montreal Economic Institute and the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And all those kind of right-wing institutes, they're kind of opaque about their funding, but there is kind of pretty clear ties that are going on there. And they're sort of one piece of this echo chamber. And they play a very important role especially in the more right-wing media, in the Sun papers, and in the National Post and the Financial Post. They're constantly churning out op-eds and publishing these kinds of scaremongering perspectives on pharmacare and the dangers that it supposedly represents for Canadians and their access to drugs. But that's sort of one piece of the echo chamber. The other side of it are the more establishment and more respectable think tanks that also get funding from the insurance industry and from Big Pharma. That would be the C.D. Howe Institute, the Conference Board of Canada, and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. And so in this case, it's not just the funding that they're getting from these industries, but you can actually map quite clearly, and that's one of the things we get into in the report, is that the research is really being directed. And in some cases, it's almost like a pay-to-play kind of scheme. In the case of the Conference Board of Canada, there was a multi-year, multi-million-dollar research program that was set up called the Canadian Alliance for Sustainable Healthcare. Pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies were major investors in this. And for a number of years, it produced conferences and reports on pharmacare, which invariably came back to the conclusion, again, at variance with the kind of scientific and academic consensus that I think people like Marc-André and Dr. Joel Lexgen have helped to build in favor of a public single-payer pharmacare system, and kind of rejecting that and saying, no, it's too costly, it's too complicated, we should really just do a fill the gaps. And I think what's different about the C.D. Howe and the Conference Board of Canada and their kind of advocacy for the fill the gaps model is they're not so much targeting a popular audience as policymakers and the more serious kind of media outlets that regard them as a more credible source of information. And I would argue they are not. Just to take one example, a number that has circulated tremendously both here in Ottawa and in the media is this idea that 97% of Canadians have drug coverage. And it's been taken up by opponents of pharmacare, by these experts, and taken up by also the Conservative Party. If you were watching the Standing Committee on Health hearings on the bill, the kind of rapid fire 2-day hearings that they did, both Stephen Ellis and Todd Doherty and other Conservative members of the committee repeatedly came back to this. They said 97% of Canadians have coverage. This is a small problem affecting a small number of people. So why don't we just, do a fill the gaps program, just insure the uninsured, and everything will be fine. And of course, the problem with this number, first of all, it massively understates the rate of people who don't have any drug coverage, any drug insurance. But more importantly, it kind of misses the actual problem, which is many, many, many people in Canada have some kind of drug coverage, but they still can't afford the meds, right? They have an insurance plan that covers part of the cost, but they still face incredibly high out-of-pocket costs because the drug prices are going up and up and up, as Marc-André was talking about. And so it completely misspecifies the problem and misleads people. But I think what's interesting about this statistic is it came from a report done by the Conference Board of Canada a couple of months after the Liberals and the NDP agreed to bring forward Pharmacare. So there's a report that came out in May 2022, published by the Conference Board. And based on a very questionable methodology, they arrived at this number. And it was a kind of an update of a report that had been done back in 2017, which in the documents, it shows that the research committee was overseen by two people from Innovative Medicines Canada, right, which is the peak lobbying body for the pharmaceutical industry here in Canada, and two people from CLHIA, the Canadian Life and Health Insurance Association. Again, the peak insurance industry lobbying body here in Canada. So, you have the Conference Board of Canada saying, we're independent, we don't do lobbying, we're just providing evidence-based research for policymakers to make decisions on important matters for Canadians. And here you have the two industries that have the most stake in what happens on Pharmacare, getting to really oversee and direct the research, and of course producing a number and a report that says, well, we don't need this policy, and it's a small problem. And so this is the kind of thing that has been circulating, and that this kind of echo chamber has been spinning out into the public debate and even polluting the policy debate, right? I mean, such as it is. If you watch the Standing Committee on Health hearings on Bill C-64, there wasn't much actual debate. It was mostly a sideshow. 2 minutes. So those are the institutions. And I think, I guess I just want to touch on one other aspect of this is the ties of the experts. And I think, the fact that corporations are funding right-wing think tanks to put out ideas into the world that are sympathetic to corporations is maybe not that shocking. Certainly wasn't shocking for me. But I think what did strike me about it, doing this research, was just how many of these researchers are actually industry consultants moonlighting as independent academics, right? Like, these are people who are working and taking contracts from pharmaceutical companies, from the insurance industry. There are people who have worked in these industries for years and continue to work for them. And you can go, you find it on their LinkedIn. It's not hidden. It's like often, it's there in plain sight. And yet they still kind of get passed off in the media as researchers, right? As people who are giving you this disinterested, maybe a right-wing perspective, but like, okay, that's interesting, right? Just, to give two examples, I think the most egregious one would be the founder of the Canadian Health Policy Institute. This is one of the right-wing institutes that I kind of forgot to mention, but is pretty important. It's Brett Skinner, who is a longtime Fraser Institute health policy guy. He was there back in 2004 and 2005 and wrote a lot of the reports that were funded by the pharmaceutical industry at that time. In 2012, he left the Fraser Institute. He was the CEO of the Fraser Institute for a little while. He left and he founded this Canadian Health Policy Institute, which is basically an academic, kind of pseudo-academic publishing outfit. And a couple of months later, he was hired by Innovative Medicines Canada. And so for the whole early years of this, the first 5 years of life of the Canadian Health Policy Institute, he was playing two roles. He was the director of research for the pharmaceutical industry and their lobby group, Innovative Medicines Canada. And he was playing, this kind of alter ego in the media as an independent expert at the Canadian Health Policy Institute. And so that's really shocking to me. I think it's really egregious, but it's something that you see again and again and again with almost each and every one of these experts. One other example of that, I think, which was telling, and it's on the other side of the aisle, is a C.D. Howe senior fellow called Marcel Saulnier, who's been cited a few times in the media on these issues. And again, he's cited as someone from the C.D. Howe Institute, and he's very sophisticated. He knows the policy really well. He worked with the Hoskins on the
Council for the Implementation of National Fund.
There you go, with that, whatever that mouthful is. He worked for the Hoskins report, and he also happens to be a lobbyist with Santa's Health, right? And Santa Health is a lobbying firm that is working for Johnson & Johnson and a number of other pharmaceutical companies, and was recently reported that the firm was lobbying on Pharmacare, right, for Johnson & Johnson. So he, even was a panelist at a CD Howe event in October 2023, which was sponsored by Johnson & Johnson, right? And this is at a time when the negotiations between the Liberals and the NDP were kind of at the point of breaking down, right? And so the CD Howe holds this event and has Saulnier on the panel. And so you have Johnson & Johnson funding it. You have their guy pretending to be an independent academic, speaking to people in Ottawa, trying to convince them of the benefits of the fill the gaps model. And he's actually working for a lobbying firm that is also being paid by Johnson & Johnson. And so it gets very, very tangled up. And so I guess I would just conclude by one of the things we did with this research was we kind of cataloged the articles that have been written by these experts and the think tanks over the last 2 years, since, from March 2022 until the present. And we just wanted to see, like, how often are these really glaring and overlapping conflicts of interest ever raised and noted, right? I found one example outside of our field of study, right? In a healthydebate.ca, there was one article where some of these guys were identified as people who work for the industry. There were 74 op-eds or news articles that cited these people. Not one of them cited the fact that these people have some, multifarious ties to the pharmaceutical and insurance industries. And I think that is a huge problem. I think one of the reasons we did this report is to try to change that. I think we see it as a resource for journalists to consult. And I've had at least one journalist tell me that they actually did consult it after it came out, and it made them reconsider interviewing one of these people. So there's a small victory there. But I think we're going to have to continue to get it out there, because we know that the industry is going to continue pushing these people forward to try to discredit and confuse the issue. And, I think it's a real threat for our democracy and for our policy process in general. I mean, it's a much bigger problem. I think it's particularly egregious in this case, Pharmacare, but it's something we see in all sorts of domains. We see it with respect to climate change and how big oil is funding kind of phony citizen front groups and so on. And yeah, so there's still a lot of work to be done. But so I'm happy to present on this, and hopefully we can use this to to inform policymakers, to inform journalists, and to inform our supporters and our people who might be taken in by some of these arguments that are really just being pushed out by industry actors. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Can you pass the pepper, please?
I'll just note for the group that we did start a little late. I only have 3 panelists, so I'm letting them speak a little bit longer than the 10 minutes. Over to the man, the myth, the legend, Dr. Joel Lection.
How do I get the slides up?
They're coming. Oh, I heard Michael from upstairs. He says they're coming, they're coming.
They're coming. All right,
You can start.
so I'll get started then. So I'm going to take a step back and talk about the quality, if we ever get Pharmacare, which possibly, likely not, but if we do, what are the quality of the drugs that are going to be funded by a public plan? And are they going to be what we expect of them? So there's my conflicts of interest. I'll leave it up for the average 2.8 seconds that speakers usually do. Had time to read it? Okay, let's go on. You want to read them? My God,
No.
people are so demanding.
I think it had an influence, yeah.
All right? Okay. So I'm going to cover a number of topics. So what are the characteristics of drugs, new drugs that our companies are submitting for approval to Health Canada? What's the quality of information that Health Canada discloses? What are the patients who are enrolled in the trials like? What kind of reviews does Health Canada use? I'll explain that, and changes in the data between 2012 and 2022. So the data that I'm using comes from annual reports from Health Canada about new drugs that it's approved. There will be a final slide about that. The World Health Organization, and a document called the Summary Basis of Decision, which basically explains why Health Canada chose to approve or not approve a new drug. And it gives information about the clinical trials, the patients in the clinical trials, etc. All right, so you're going to see a lot of figures for a couple of minutes, and I will then explain what those figures are. So more orphan drugs. These are drugs for rare diseases, usually defined as a disease that occurs in 1 in 2,000 people or fewer. So we're seeing an increase in the number of orphan drugs that are being produced or being approved by Health Canada. We're also seeing an increase in the number of drugs for cancer that are approved by Health Canada. The number of pivotal trials. Pivotal trials are the ones companies will submit a whole bunch of trials to Health Canada, but there are only usually a few that Health Canada relies on to make the decision about whether or not to approve the product. Those are called pivotal trials. The phase of the trial. So 3 phases of clinical trials. Phase 1, healthy volunteers, basically setting a what the dosage should be. When people start getting sick, that's the limit of the dose. Phase 2 are small numbers of people with the disease, usually in the range of 100 to 300. And phase 3 trials are the biggies that randomized controlled trials of 3,000 or so people. And those are the most important ones. Those are the ones that give you the most information. Are the trials randomized or not? If they're not randomized, there's much greater chance of bias associated with them. And finally, are they blinded? So blinding essentially means that the patients don't know what they're getting, and neither do the people who are running the trial. They don't know what the patients are getting. And it tries to remove subjectivity from interpreting the results. Trial design. This is an important issue which is very rarely brought up. There are different kinds of trial designs. Superiority. Is the new drug better than the existing drug? And you can see there that 2% of trials, clinical trials that Health Canada sees are superiority trials. In other words, most of the time, we have no idea whether or not the new drug is any better than the existing drugs. And finally, what's the outcome used? Outcomes, that's what happens to the patient at the end of the trial. And there are different kinds of outcomes that you can use. You can use clinical outcomes. Clinical outcomes means better quality of life, living longer. Surrogate trials means blood pressure goes up or down, cholesterol goes up or down. Often these tell you nothing about either the quality of the patient's life or whether or not they live longer. You hope that they do, but often they don't. Okay, keep going. Number of patients per trial. So this is, let's see. Yes, number of patients per trial. The more patients you have, the more likely, possibly, the greater variety of people you have in the trial. So you can, when the trial is done, you can be more confident about generalizing to the overall population. If you've got fewer patients in a trial, then you have less confidence. And finally, sex. How many men, how many women are in the trials? So what is all this information? Oh, some more. What kind of review does Health Canada give to trial, to these drugs that it's considering? So there are three kinds of reviews. There's the standard, that's 300 days. The company dumps all the data with Health Canada. When we did it in paper form, it was 10,000, 20,000 pages. Now it's pixels. I don't know how many pages that represents, but that's a standard standard review. Then there's what's called a notice of compliance with conditions. This is usually, well, we don't have all the data, but we think it looks good. So here, Health Canada, you take a look at it. And if you think that it looks good, then Health Canada will approve the drug on conditions. And the company then has to fulfill those conditions in order to get a full approval. But in the meantime, doctors like me, well, except I don't have a license anymore, were prescribing these drugs without knowing how good they were, without knowing how safe they were. And orphan drug status. Again, this is drugs for rare diseases, and we see that there's an increasing percent of those being approved. So what does all this mean? So more orphan drugs. Orphan drugs are expensive. They make up, I think, about 5% of prescriptions, but they take up about 30% of the money that we spend on prescription drugs. So more orphan drugs may be good if you have an orphan disease, but whether or not the data justifies the approval of these things is more in question. And in fact, if you look at therapeutic ratings for orphan drugs, which I have done, but therapeutic ratings by independent organizations, what you find is that drugs for orphan diseases are no more therapeutically beneficial than drugs for non-orphan diseases, but we allow companies to charge a lot more for them. And we are proving more and more of these. And they're more likely to be approved under a notice of compliance with conditions, which means that they're more expensive and we know less about how well they work when they come on the market. More cancer drugs might be a good thing, but 50% of the cancer drugs that Health Canada approves don't show any meaningful change in overall life expectancy, and they don't show any change in the quality of life. So is that a good thing? Again, these things are more and more expensive. Fewer pivotal trials, fewer blinded trials, fewer randomized trials. All that means is the data that's being used to approve these drugs is becoming scarcer and scarcer and less rigorous. If you have more pivotal trials, then you have more confidence that the drugs actually do what they're supposed to do and that they're as safe as they're supposed to be. Fewer pivotal trials decreases your confidence. Fewer randomized trials means more chance of bias. Fewer blinded trials, again, means more chance of bias. Only a small number of trials are superiority ones, 2%. So again, what I said earlier, drugs come on the market. So here I am sitting in front of a patient. There's a new drug, there's an old drug. Should I give the new drug? Is it going to help the patient more? I have no idea. And in 2019 to 2022, only a minority of trials use clinical outcomes. In other words, they were relying on surrogate outcomes, and often surrogate outcomes don't predict whether or not people are going to feel better or live longer. This is just going back to the notice of compliance with conditions, and don't look at all the numbers. You're just looking at 15 drugs who have currently fulfilled their conditions took more than 6 years to do it, and 4 of them took more than 10 years to do it. So 6 years prescribing the drug, don't know how well it's going to work, don't know how safe it is. And the ones that haven't fulfilled their conditions, there are 13 of them that have been on the market for more than 6 years. How long is it going to take? Well, we don't know because Health Canada won't give us that information. And there are 4 that are currently on the market that are 10 years out and haven't fulfilled their conditions. All right, so what does all this mean? The good. Health Canada is increasing the disclosure of the age of patients in trials, but only in a minority of the trials. They have all the data, they just don't bother letting us know. Health Canada is increasing the disclosure of the sex of patients in trials, but again, only in a minority of the trials. Why are they keeping this data secret? Don't have any idea. Health Canada is increasing the disclosure of the number of patients in the trials, so that's good. We have a better idea that more people are being tested and hopefully a greater variety of people. Why are the changes happening? The first thing I think is lobbying from the drug companies. The drug companies are interested in getting their products onto the market faster, start to make money off of them. They're putting pressure on Health Canada, not just Health Canada, also the FDA, the European Medicines Agency, the Australian Therapeutic Goods Agency, approve our drugs faster, and the agencies are responding. And that goes along with keeping up with the neighbors. If the FDA is doing it, or the European Medicines Agency is doing it, then Health Canada better do it, because the threat implied is that if you don't do these things, if you don't make these changes, we just won't bother submitting the drugs to Health Canada in the first place. So you'll do without. And finally, possibly a reasonable reason why these changes are taking place is that there are a lot of new kinds of therapies that are coming on the market. So gene therapy, advanced cell therapies, and these require a change in regulatory standards because of the fundamentally different nature of these products. All right. Okay, I'll be done. All right. This slide just says that most of the new drugs that come onto the market have no additional therapeutic value compared to what's already present. So the bottom color, which is, I don't know, what is that these days? Blue? Thank you. 10 to 15%. So 1 in 10 to 1 in 7 new drugs that come on the market actually make a major difference to people's lives. The orange, that's moderate. So yeah, maybe a little bit of difference. Maybe you'll feel better. And the green, which is over 50%, they're only valuable to the drug companies because they're not any better than what already exists. So if anybody wants to read about this, all this stuff that I've been talking about, this is the article. And finally, I have one last slide to speak about what kind of information we're getting from Health Canada. So Health Canada used to publish an annual report about new drug approvals, but it stopped. The last report that came out covered 2021 to 2022, March 31st, 2022. Then nothing went away. And why did it go away? Health Canada didn't bother to say. Is it coming back? Health Canada hasn't bothered to say. The Patent and Medicine Prices Review Board, this is an agency which sets a maximum introductory price for new patented drugs. They used to publish in their annual report the therapeutic value of the new drugs that they considered. They stopped doing that. The last report that did that was covered 2022. And that's never coming back, according to the people I've talked to. So we will have no idea from the government how therapeutically valuable all these new drugs that they approve are. And finally, in 2014, CADTH, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology in Health, started to require user fees from the drug companies in order to consider their products. They do what's called a health technology assessment. They assess whether or not we get value for these drugs. Before they started to accept user fees, about 50% of the non-cancer drugs got a positive recommendation. In other words, CADTH was saying to the provinces and the territories, you should fund this product. After they started to accept user fees, that 50% goes to 85%. No difference in the characteristics of the drugs, no difference in the clinical trials being used for these drugs. What happened? Well, I'll leave that to your imagination. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. Now, at the risk of standing between you and lunch, if anybody has burning questions, please head to the microphone. Okay. Oh, here comes one of our Canadian Health Coalition board members.
Shout, Keith.
Okay, I'll shout. Yes. Yes, I didn't need it.
For translation, no.
I just, one of your slides, when you totaled up the, the moderate improvements of the new drugs and then the major improvements. Back in 2011, I think it was like more than half, except for, those totaled up to more than half of all the new drugs. It's like big.
Well, partly it's just data. I mean, early on, I was using fewer sources that evaluated the therapeutic value of new drugs. Now I'm using more, and I take, to give the drugs the benefit of the doubt, I take the best rating. So I have 4 data sources. If one of them says the drug is very valuable, then it outweighs the other 3 that might say it's not that valuable. So that's one thing. The other thing I think is the quality of the drugs that drug companies are submitting. So we see that. So what is there? Aduhelm, a drug for Alzheimer's, wasn't approved in Canada, but we are getting probably 2 or 3 Alzheimer's drugs that Health Canada is going to approve that are more or less useless and possibly dangerous because they cause brain swelling, and in some people they cause hemorrhages. But Health Canada is probably going to approve them because the FDA has approved them. We have a drug that was approved under a notice of compliance with conditions for ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Lou Gehrig disease, approved with conditions. Those conditions weren't fulfilled, and the drug just got pulled from the market, but it was being prescribed for a few years here in Canada. So 2 things. One is I'm using more data, and 2 is the drugs are more crappy.
Thanks. Garbage drugs, as I believe I've seen you say regarding these drugs.
All right, I didn't think I was a conspiracy theorist, but apparently I am after hearing some of our speakers here today. Follow the money, check the credentials, and Neil.
Yeah, I don't know. So,
And
I
Neil,
mean,
they do?
yeah, thanks. Sorry, Pauline. So this has been very helpful, except that when we hear the government, when we hear the health minister, when we hear the direction this is going, and when you talk about the number of lobbyists and how much they've been putting into it, we sort of, have victory within our reach, at least to begin this. But I don't think we're winning, right? Like, I think that it's all at risk because of the fact that I don't think we've been able to apply the same level of political pressure as the other side, obviously. So do you have any suggestions on what we can do? I mean, we have to take this across the line. The window is there. It's closing. Marc-Andre pointed to the long arc of Hoskins and that we've been pushing this. We know all the good work that all of you have done and the Canadian Health Coalition. It's got us to this point, but it's not across the line. So the question is, how do we get it across the line? What do you have to tell us all that we need to be doing more of and work harder? Over to you. Save us.
Thank you for this very easy question. No, thank you, Anil. And I think one of the issue is just, with the Hoskins report was something a bit fantastic, but very prudent, basically putting in place a system where you can make sure that people will see a difference. And it's also the idea, nobody was losing their coverage with the Hoskins report. Basically, it's just we have public coverage that is growing for all drugs, but we're not taking away any private coverage. I mean, these are negotiations between employees and employers. So basically, you reduce a lot of the pushback you can get on this. That being said, now C64, the way it is being handled and the way the health minister basically see in C64 an open window to negotiate whatever he wants with any province based on what these provinces will want. For me, that brings us back, when it comes to Medicare in Canada, it started with a province, started with Saskatchewan at the time. And I think we need also to make sure we do the pushing at the provincial level when it comes to Pharmacare. One of the big issue is that for a lot of the provincial drug plan, the current system is amazing in terms of capacity of cost shifting. I mean, private drug plans, they're just suckers for punishment. And basically what we will be doing is we will try to negotiate larger rebates by just shifting the cost on private plans who are not negotiating these private rebates anyway. So what we're seeing a lot is this entrenchment, a lot of financial incentives even for public governments to keep the current system in place. So just an example for this. Some of the drugs, Repatha, for example, to lower cholesterol, I like to take this example. The official price is $6,000. And CADIF recommendation, well, you need to get a confidential rebate of at least 90% in order to cover this drug. Otherwise, it's not worth it. And since provinces are covering the drug, so they got at least 90%. Normally, they're following the CADIF recommendations on this. And look at Quebec. In Quebec, if you are covered with the public drug plan, basically, you still need to pay out of pocket up to $1,200 a year. So in co-pays and deductibles. So for this $6,000 drug, your co-pays and deductibles will be based not on once the confidential rebate kicked in, it's based on the official price. So in the end, I have a 35% copay plus deductibles. I will be paying my $1,200 a year out of pocket for this drug that is costing the government only $600. So I'm paying out of pocket $1,200 for a drug that is only $600. And in order to get that coverage, because 98%, 97% of Canadians are covered, in order to get that coverage, I also need to pay $731 a year in premiums in order to get that coverage that will make me pay more out of pocket than the real price of the product. And what I was hoping with C64, you know, when it comes to federal provincial relationships, most of the province, sometimes it's very difficult to give them a kick in the butt for things to advance. And the federal government sometimes as a role is just, okay, for the provinces, they can say, oh, it's not our fault. The federal government forced us to do this. So it's the federal. And sometimes it does work. It's one of the rare things that does work in the Canadian Federation, more or less. I was hoping this to happen with C64. I'm not seeing that right now, but we can have surprises. I don't know. But I think we need to gear up our game in terms of the lobbying at the provincial level. And I think with these confidential rebates, just you're in BC. I mean, if you need to pay 3% of your annual income in deductibles before paying for the drug, okay, 3% of my annual income, let's say somebody will be paying the same thing, $1,500 a year to get the Repata before getting any coverage. But the thing is, when you're paying this, you're paying your deductibles in terms of a percentage of your annual income for catastrophic coverage, the government still get the rebate at the same time. So you will be paying more than the real price of the product. And who is getting the rebate? Government will be getting this rebate. So I think there's different ways to shame governments based on the way we organize the current system in order to show we need to clean this up and we need a rational system, universal pharmacare. So.
Thank you. Thanks, Marc-Andre.